This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Sam Frings, who founded the Organic Nursery. Sam explains in his own words how he got started and how things have been along the way. But his journey was partly inspired by this podcast and listening to some previous guests, including the nursery that was so anti-plastic they managed polytunnel-free propagation. It's not easy being a pioneer, but listen on to find out how Sam and his family have battled against the odds to do it right.
I started gardening when I was a little lad. My grandma had a sort of an organic smallhold in Lyme Regis that she sort of won every competition that was going. She got banned from entering some of the competitions because she just kept winning them, and she got like cups named after her and everything. So every summer I used to go down there and spend the whole summer just helping out, really, getting chased by the sheep and digging up the spuds and everything. So that kind of started me off on the route. And then I used to carry on, had a little spot in the garden at home as well that I kind of tried to make mine, and everything used to die all the time. And, you know, you're just sort of messing about and planting things and having no idea what's going on. I mean, sort of life carried on and I grew up and I fell out of it, really. Didn't do much, just sort of kept on top of the garden we had when we bought our house with a family and stuff. But obviously with a young family, it all kind of gets away from you. And then a few years ago, we decided to have a birthday for my little girl in the garden, birthday party. And I grew all my own seeds and everything for that. And I was like, well, this is all doable. And then there was that awful summer with the 40-degree heat. Some of the gardens struggled and just sort of tried to keep it going. And then all these things kind of came together, and I was like, I'd love to start a business selling plants, and I'd also love to do one that kind of raised awareness of how what everybody does in their garden can help do a little bit towards fighting climate change, because it really felt to me like the government and so forth, there was always lots of lip service, never really much happened. And then making your own changes always felt like sort of shouting into the void. But then I realized that if you could have enough people making changes in a way that wasn't sort of making people do things but just out of choice, then it could make a bit of a difference. You know, if everybody planted, say, like 8 grasses, it would sequester like so much carbon over the country that it's crazy. It's like thousands and thousands of acres of trees equivalent to. So that's why I thought, well, do you know what? I'll start a little nursery. But I wanted to do it in a way that had no impact as well. So that's why I tried. I mean, it's all been a big learning curve. So I started off just growing things I already had some obviously plastic pots behind the shed and stuff, everybody does. And then transferring them into newspaper pots to sell. And that quickly sort of drove me a bit mad, making that many newspaper pots. So then I moved into using wood fibre pots and then overwintering them in like homemade troughs made out of pallet wood and so forth. And it's all been like a massive learning curve on the best way to do things. But the feedback I've had from people has been that it's something that doesn't happen because big companies have their systems, but it's something that can happen, and it's a really good way of doing it. And yeah, it's just sort of grown over the years into something that's been, I mean, I'm still fairly new. I've only been doing it for a few years, but it's grown into something that's been like a really exciting way of doing things that I'm just trying to make a little difference and just show that gardening and nurseries and so forth can be run in different ways, and we can go back to different systems and older ways of growing.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what you are doing. And one of the things that you mentioned on your website is that you're chemical free. So I wondered if you could explore that a little bit, but also I'm guessing that comes with challenges. So maybe you could talk about those a little bit as well.
Yeah, my biggest challenges on the nursery are slugs and the odd aphid attack. Now, the way I tried to sort of a bit of a live and let live situation, you know, the aphids come and sometimes I have to throw away some plants, and sometimes the slugs destroy a load of seedlings. But then I also just try and do things like I grow my plants in the wood fibre pots. So I have like a wire mesh that they sit in, and then they're raised off the ground on wooden legs, so that I basically put sandpaper along the bottom of the legs, and the slugs don't go up them because I don't like to go past the sandpaper. So even though I've got like an unnatural amount of lush green growth, they don't tend to get in them, and I can just handpick any that do get over because there's not that many. Whereas the first year when I did it and I was growing everything at ground level, I had real problems. So I was like, so again, it's a case of, like I was saying, kind of finding different solutions that aren't just turning into chemicals.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? It's like you said, everybody accepts the norm and thinks, okay, well, this is what we stand plants on, this is how they grow, this is what the setup should look like. But it's just finding workarounds, really. And thinking about feeding your plants, how do you do that?
So I use a compost from the Lake District called Dalefoot Wool Compost. And I don't know if you've heard of it before, but it's basically, they have like organic sheep flock that they use the wool from that, the bracken off the fowls that I think sort of an invasive plant there, and then comfrey, which they grow as a cover crop. So those all feed the plants for a year without any supplementary feeding. It's just they got a nice slow natural decomposition process that feeds them really well. And I think the only plant that I've ever had to supplementary feed was some buddleias, just because they were growing so fast. And then I just used some seaweed feed and some a little bit of hoof and horn. I accept that my plants grow a bit slower. I accept that they're not ready at the same time as the big commercial nurseries are, where they're growing them under lights and under heat and feeding them lots of synthetic fertilizers. But at the same time, it's because it makes a massive difference to the world. The amount of emissions that are caused by creating synthetic fertilizers is insane. And I'm not saying that every crop should be grown organically. I don't know whether we could feed the world like that. I don't really have an opinion. But when I'm doing something for an ornamental purpose, it seems crazy that we would choose to make the world worse in the process.
When you put it in those terms, it absolutely does. I think that, maybe this time of year when your garden's not got a lot going on and you go down the garden centre and you see all these fantastic plants, that's when your common sense goes out the window and your little reptile brain goes, I must have that lovely flower. And that's the issue.
Absolutely.
We have to kind of retrain ourselves to be sensible and a little bit, delayed gratification. So the other thing that really interests me about what you do is the fact that you're plastic free. How easy has that been to achieve?
Well, like I was saying, so it's been a massive learning curve, really. So when I was trialing how to do it, I was growing in the plastic pots that I already had from a lifetime of pottering around in the garden, and then transferring them into newspaper pots that I built myself. But like I said, that's incredibly time intensive, and it was driving me slowly mad. So you can get these little wood fiber pots. You get 8 centimeter ones, and then they do root train ones, and little sort of almost jumbo plug pot size. And they're made in France, so they're not like from the other side of the world. And they're using sustainable wood shavings and so forth. And they tend to last for, if they're not being moved around and handled too much, they'll last for a season they'll last until they're ready to be planted out. So the roots then grow straight through as they grow and take over the compost space. They then grow through the sides of the pot. So one, you're not getting encircling roots inside the pot. They're self-pruning as they reach the air. And then you can just plant them straight in the ground and they decompose really quickly when they're in contact with the soil and the microbes. So you're not getting any root disturbance. You're not creating waste. You're not having to pick up plastic pots all around the garden after you've finished an afternoon of planting plants, all these sort of things. And so that works really well for the smaller pots. And then once I get to the end of the season, I won't look into overwinter or they're getting bigger. I've literally, like I said, just find pallets out and about, just pull them apart. I'm getting quite good at that now. I've got a good technique. And then turn them into big sort of wooden troughs that are just the right size to be able to put in. I've made a homemade steamer so I can steam them whenever I want to change the crop in them and change the compost and so forth. And again, the things that I've grown in those troughs over this winter, for instance, and it's been an incredibly wet winter. It's been warm and wet. And a lot of things you would expect to die. Everything that's been in those troughs that if you were to overwinter in plastic pots. But everything in those troughs have not just survived, they've thrived. I've got them, they're growing too big now I need to dig them out and sell them soon. They're going to be too big to post. But and then again, people think that you need to grow things in plastic pots because you can't, dig things out of the ground in the middle of the summer. It's difficult to dig things out of soil in the middle of the summer, but because these are grown in quite a loose, aerated compost, they come out. You can literally put your hand in, sort of move it around the plant and then lift it up, and they just come out lovely with some roots sticking out through the sides that have grown in the last few months. But you're not having to cut through a massive long root run, which would make the plant wilt, because the roots are still quite constricted in a wooden trough.
And how about things like, there's infrastructure items such as like a polytunnel or water butts, hose pipes, all those kind of things. Have you managed to find any alternatives to those?
So I don't use polytunnels. I've got no plastic polytunnels or greenhouses. The only thing I use is I've got cold frames outside that I built from old. You know how you get toughened shower glass doors? Because I've got kids, it was quite important. I wanted toughened glass. So I've made my own cold frames with those. They're perfect. They've got a hinge on the end as well. So they make a really easy cold frame. Again, the stuff in the troughs pretty much stays south water with the rain. Unless it's a really, really hot, dry summer, because they're mulched as well, they don't need much extra care. And then I do water the wood fibre pots with a hose pipe. So that's pretty much my only plastic thing. And then again, it's been a bit of a learning curve getting the right sort of parceling materials, because obviously plastic's so ubiquitous that it's quite difficult to find things that are home compostable for the boxes that I'm sending out. So right now I've discovered that wrapping them in newspaper, it doesn't soak through very quickly, in wood wool to cushion it. And then the labels are sugar cane, they're home compostable with starch glues, the tapes, paper with starch glues again. Those products are there in the market. It's just fighting through the greenwashing to find the right ones.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. It is so hard to find something that's genuinely, environmentally sound. And another thing that you mentioned on your website is plants for climate change. And I was curious to know, are there some plants that are better at carbon capture, for example, or are you thinking more about stuff for pollinators?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a mixture of both those things, and they all work together hand in hand. So especially for climate change, for capturing carbon, there's been studies in America where they've shown the root run of an ornamental grass, and it goes, tens of feet. And the deeper the root is, the lower down in the soil that the carbon's captured, because obviously there's carbon in the root mass itself and carbon's released into the soil. There's exudates that the soil microbes then feed on and convert the carbon and lock it into some of the mineral particles. It's a bit complicated and sciencey, but basically the longer the root run, the deeper the carbon goes and the longer it stays in the ground. So they reckon that a perennial grass, I think it sequesters about 1.34 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare, which works out as more efficient than planting trees. So for every year, I think it's something like every year that you plant one of these grasses and it lives for, it's the equivalent of 10 years of planting a tree, because obviously a sapling's small, and until that tree's grown for 10, 20, 30 years, it's just not getting anywhere near the size, whereas the grasses are sequestering that every single year. So whilst you think like, well, not everybody can grow a tree in the garden, absolutely, but everybody can grow a few grasses, and that would really help mitigate like your own personal emissions.
Yeah, that's amazing. And thinking about pollinators as well then, so you'll be growing stuff that is particularly beneficial for pollinators in terms of food or habitat, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I try and grow a whole mixture of things, because you want the flowering to go out throughout the year so that the pollinators are being fed, especially with the changes in the weather, means that some plants aren't behaving the way pollinators might expect, and pollinators are sometimes coming out at different times than normal food sources. So I think it's important just to have a whole mix of stuff rather than just saying like, oh, just natives. I think because our weather is no longer just native, I think it's important to have a mixture of many different flowering plants and then places for insects to overwinter in. So again, long grasses, they're brilliant for insects to overwinter in, and just various things like that. It's just to have as wide a range of things in your garden as possible so that you can kind of look after all manner of different pollinators and other beneficial insects.
Absolutely. One of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about your nursery and how you operate, and obviously the good work that you're doing, I was thinking about things like how feasible it would be for you to harvest and package your own seeds, for example. All of these things can help cut down on the carbon footprint of what you're selling. And then a thing went off in my brain and said, sometimes the rules and regulations around nurseries are not necessarily geared to help somebody who's trying to move in the direction that you are. Do you find that you're sometimes hamstrung by different things, such as the rules that kind of govern your industry? Or do you think that things are changing so that it's making it more feasible for you to operate in that way?
I think it's perfectly feasible, because I mean, I had the plant health inspection when we opened, and the inspector who came around was really positive about what I was trying to do and really encouraging and enthusiastic about the whole thing. There was no mention, I sort of said, because I suppose I'd planned out ways to protect health of the plants, such as making the troughs small enough so I could fit them in my steamer, which I've made out of like an old metal drum with basically a stopcock and a heating element. So it just sort of, it's basic, but you can do the maths and work out how long to steam things for. And they were really enthusiastic about all these different things because I thought out how to make sure the plants were going to go out healthy. So I don't think that the problem comes from the regulations. I think the problem comes from the nurseries want to be efficient. They want to use potting machines. Those wood fibre pots are difficult to use in a potting machine. They obviously want to have everything regulated. So, you apply this amount of chemical at this time of the year and so forth. But I suppose that's because that's the industry that we live in now and that the country has. But does that have to be the future? I mean, I could never plough out the number of plants that obviously that the big companies do, but you could always have 50 of my sort of nursery for every one big one, and just change the way that you buy and change the way that we think about how plants should be. I don't think it's from the government. I don't think it's from the regulations that there's an issue.
Well, that's exactly it. And that was actually going to be a question that I ask you about kind of bigger nurseries and how quickly they're making changes. But they're led by consumers a lot of the time, especially, as you said, when you're growing at scale and you're growing for maybe the trade rather than retail. And it's tricky because there's the demand there for big planting schemes that require big numbers of plants that are uniform. So, yeah, as you said, we need to change lots of things that will feed into the nursery trade as a whole. And hopefully the future won't look necessarily like the current situation does. And thinking of that, I think you're quite keen on community involvement and getting the next generation to get on board with that way of thinking. So how do you encourage that?
I mean, like I was saying, the industry is working the way it does and consumers want to consume the way they do. And I'm not going to fight a rising tide. So speaking to my children about, not in like doom and gloom ways, but about like how they'd like things to be in the future and stuff. And it made me think they're so enthusiastic and so willing to think about things in a different way because they don't have preconceived ideas. It was more about getting into schools and talking to children about these sort of issues. So I'm doing a talk at a local school about going in there, we're going to plant some wildflower seed. All the kids are going to have their own little wooden pots and plant some wildflower seeds that they can look after and hopefully tie that into like the beelines activities, which is trying to create like corridors for pollinators around the country so that they can learn about the sort of things that are affecting pollinators and other insects, how the plants that they're growing are being fed and how they can be fed naturally and without these sort of synthetic inputs. And then you can sort of raise in their mind what that would mean for the future and what sort of world they'd like to grow into. And then hopefully, I mean, I'm one person doing things locally, it's never going to change the world. But at the same time, it could change the world for certain people. Those people could go home to their families and maybe not install that plastic lawn. Maybe they could plant flowers instead and just sort of start conversations at home or whatever it might be. It might just make little differences.
Yeah, and I think that although you say that you can't change the world, I think it's that sort of knock-on effect. People see what you're doing and it inspires them to then try and do things differently. The other thing I think that is important to recognise, given the changes that I personally would like to see, and that would be more kind of local growing, and it would be perhaps a return to maybe specialist nurseries even. Lots of things, though, have to change in order for that to happen. And we were chatting beforehand and you said, obviously you have to make a profit. That's business. But I think that maybe two challenges I would say going forward are, one, that maybe the skills are not necessarily there at the moment. And the other thing is the sort of availability of people to do the work. Have you noticed anything on that front, in terms of, potential hope in that area or maybe challenges?
I mean, I do have a small nursery. It's family run, so it's me and my wife do it. So I haven't employed any staff to help us so far. But what I have noticed, like when I sell the plants, I sell them at a local farmers market in Chilwell called Barton Bros Market. And it's lovely there. And you have a whole range of people coming in of all ages. And I've noticed that there are people that are in their 20s that are very keen gardeners. So those skills, I think as a nation, we're always having gardeners, even if you look around and you see a lot of gardens just being turned into driveways and zero life areas. There is still a lot of younger people that are keen on gardening, are keen on nature, and the skills aren't rocket science. They're just, practice and mindset, really. So I wouldn't say that there's an issue with the ability for people to do it.
Thank you very much to Sam. Since recording the interview, Sam has told me that to preserve his sanity, he's stepping back from the markets this year in order to concentrate on the mail order side of his work and his community work. Indeed, some of the bedding plants he grew to sell at the markets, he's donating to a school to raise money at a spring fair. So thank you to Sam, and thank you for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 55 with Chris Williams of Edible Culture Limited, which was released on the 9th of July 2019, about running a green nursery. And also episode 84, School Gardening with the Mini Horts, which was released on the 11th of February 2020, about, unsurprisingly, gardening in schools. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.